I love that song that Mary was playing for the offertory, Leaning on the Everlasting Arms. That goes so beautifully with the message today. The text for the sermon comes from the book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy chapter 8, we're going to read verses 1 through 20. Now the setting that we're reading is at the end of the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness for the nation of Israel. 40 years ago they left Egypt by the providence and hand of God. For 40 years now they've been wandering in the wilderness. That period is over. They're about to enter into the promised land. And Moses speaks these words to them. Deuteronomy chapter 8, beginning in verse 1. The whole commandment that I command you today, you shall be careful to do, that you may live and multiply and go in and possess the land that the Lord swore to give to your fathers. You shall remember the whole way that the Lord your God has led you these 40 years in the wilderness, that he might humble you, testing you to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not. And he humbled you, and let you hunger, and fed you with manna, which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that he might make you know that man does not live by bread alone, but lives by every word that comes from the mouth of God. Your clothing did not wear out on you, and your foot did not swell these 40 years. Know then in your heart that as a man disciplines his son, the Lord your God disciplines you. So you shall keep the commandments of the Lord your God by walking in his ways and fearing him. For the Lord your God is bringing you into a good land, a land of brooks, of water, of fountains and springs, flowing out in the valleys and hills, a land of wheat and barley, of vines and fig trees and pomegranates, a land of olive trees and honey, a land in which you will eat bread without scarcity, in which you will lack nothing, a land whose stones are iron, and out of whose hills you can dig copper. You shall eat and be full, and you shall bless the Lord your God for the good land he has given you. Take care lest you forget the Lord your God by not keeping his commandments and his rules and his statutes, which I command you today. Lest when you have eaten and are full and have built good houses and live in them, and when your herds and flocks multiply, and your silver and gold is multiplied, and all that you have is multiplied, then your heart be lifted up, and you forget the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, who led you through the great and terrifying wilderness with its fiery serpents and scorpions and thirsty ground where there was no water, who brought you out of the water, who brought you water out of the flinty rock, who fed you in the wilderness with manna that your fathers did not know, that he might humble you and test you to do you good in the end. Beware lest you say in your heart, my power and the might of my hand have gotten me this wealth. You shall remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you power to get wealth, that he may confirm his covenant that he swore to your fathers, as it is to this day. And if you forget the Lord your God, and go after the other gods, and serve them, and worship them, I solemnly warn you today that you shall surely perish. Like the nations that the Lord makes to perish before you, so shall you perish, because you would not obey the voice of the Lord your God. I read about a woman who had a parakeet by the name of Chippy. And Chippy lived a very comfortable, happy life until everything changed one day. The woman decided that she was going to clean out Chippy's cage with a vacuum cleaner. So she got the vacuum cleaner and took the attachment off the end and stuck it down into the bottom of Chippy's cage, and just as she did that, the phone rang. And so she turned around to answer the phone, and just as she did that, she heard a sound. And she turned back and no more Chippy. So she turned the vacuum cleaner off real quick, opened up the inside of the vacuum cleaner to look at the bag, and there was Chippy, still alive, but covered with all the stuff you'd find in a vacuum cleaner, dirt and hair and all the rest of it. And he was looking shocked, covered with all that, and so she grabbed him up out of the vacuum cleaner bag, ran him into the bathroom real quick, held him under the faucet and tried to rinse all that stuff off of him under the faucet. And then she looked down and realized that the poor little thing was freezing cold and shivering, so she did what any good pet owner would do. She got the hair dryer out, blasted him with a blast of hot air. And there was poor Chippy, stunned. A couple of days later, a friend who knew about all this asked her how Chippy was doing. And she said, well, Chippy doesn't sing much anymore. He just sits and stares. Ever felt like that? You're going along in life and everything seems to be okay, and then boom, you're like Chippy. The song sucked out of your heart and just kind of sitting and staring. Now, Moses stands to address the nation of Israel on the eve of their entrance into the Promised Land. The last 40 years have not been what they bargained for when they left Egypt. I'm sure the people who left Egypt under the promise of God anticipated a very quick journey, uneventful journey into the Promised Land, and that's not at all how things had worked out. And some of them may have felt disappointed in God or let down because the last 40 years have not been at all what they anticipated. But Moses, in his wisdom, uses the occasion to teach them some lessons that they have learned in the wilderness, although they may not realize that they've learned them. What he wants to show them is that there are some lessons that can only be learned in the wilderness. They cannot be learned when times are good. They cannot be learned when life is easy. They can only be learned in the wilderness. The first thing we learn in the wilderness, and it's in verses 1 through 6, is that it's in the wilderness that we learn to trust God. He tells them in verse 2 that the time in the wilderness was a test. He reminds them that they spent 40 years in the wilderness. 40, the number 40 in the Bible is always used to signify a time of testing. And this time in the wilderness had been a spiritual test for Israel. He gives them one example, that God had fed them with manna. Now, this was a good news, bad news proposition. The manna was given by the miraculous hand of God. That's the good news. They didn't even have to work for it. It was just there. Each day it was given to them. The bad news, if you want to think of it that way, was that only enough was given for that day. In other words, God didn't rain down enough manna for the next year. Enough was sent each day for that day. And so you can imagine that some of them went to bed each night wondering if there was going to be food to eat tomorrow, wondering if there would be enough. This was the test. This was the whole purpose of the manna, to teach them to trust God for tomorrow. Enough was given for that day, and only for that day. You see, it's in the wilderness, it's when you're going through difficult times that the genuineness of your faith is proved. Our test would never be shown to be true or not if nothing bad ever happened to us. If life was just one series of happy events after another, we'd never know whether or not our faith was real. It's only when it's tested that we know if it's true or not. Somebody said God put giants in the Promised Land to keep unbelievers out. I don't know about that, but I know for sure He put giants in the Promised Land to test their faith. And they were going to need the lessons that they had learned in the wilderness. We would never learn to depend upon God if it wasn't for the wilderness. If it wasn't for the crises in our life, we'd never learn to depend on God. Someone said this, God never fails to give us what we prayed for, except to give us something better. was thinking about that quote a lot this week, and it dawned on me, that's not something, and I agree with that, by the way. I think it's true. But that's not something you learn from reading a book. That's something you learn in the trials of life. The person who said that had been through trials and had come to the conclusion that when God says no to your prayers, it's only because He has something better in mind. You don't learn that in a book. You might read it in a book, but you don't learn it in a book. You learn that in the wilderness of life. The difficulties that Israel had gone through in the wilderness had taught them the importance of trusting God. I heard a song this week. I'd never heard it before. It was by a singer named Babby Mason. One line from the song goes like this: God is too wise to be mistaken. God is too good to be unkind. When you don't understand, when you don't see His plan, when you can't trace His hand, trust His heart. That's what Israel learned in the wilderness. Moses tells them that it was in the wilderness that we learned to trust God. And then the second thing in verses 3 through 10, it's in the wilderness that we learn to listen to God. He says to them in verse 3 that they learned in the wilderness to live not just by the daily bread of life, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. Now remember, there was no Bible yet. The Bible hadn't been written. The only thing that had ever been written down was the commandments, which had been written by the finger of God on stone. But it was in the wilderness that they learned to listen for God. I'm often asked the question, why doesn't God speak to people anymore like He used to? And my answer is always the same. He does. It's just we're not listening. God still speaks to us, but who's listening? For one thing, if you want to hear God speak, you have to be quiet. Now, God can get our attention. God can shout, don't get me wrong. And He can grab our attention even when we're not being quiet. But that still small voice of God, that never shouts. And if you want to hear that whisper of God, that still small voice, you have to be still and quiet long enough to hear it. And we have to train our spiritual ears to listen for God. I love the story of two friends who were walking along the streets in New York City. One was from New York City. One was an Indian who had grown up on an Indian reservation. And as they're walking along that crowded, busy street, one of them, the Indian says, "Do you hear that?" And his friend says, "Hear what?" And he says, "A cricket." And he said, "A cricket?" He said, "Are you crazy? With all this noise, the bustle of this crowded street, you can hear a cricket? How?" And he said, "Well, growing up on the reservation, you learn to listen for things like that." And he made the point to his friend that they couldn't hear the people of New York because it's not what they're listening for. He said, "But I'll show you what they do listen for." And he reached into his pocket and he pulled out some coins and he dropped them on the street, and suddenly everybody stopped and looked around. They heard that because it's what they listened for. Spiritually speaking, we have to train ourselves to listen for God. We have to seek God to hear Him. The Bible says in Jeremiah 29 verse 13, these are the words of God: "You will seek me and you will find me." Do you remember how the rest of the verse goes? "When you search for me with all your heart." One of the great things about the wilderness, those difficult periods of life, is they force us to focus on God in ways that we don't normally do. See, God is still speaking if we'll just listen. I love the story of a young man who answered an ad in a newspaper for a job. He was looking for a job, and this particular job was as a Morse code operator for long-distance communications, telegraph. And so he went into the office, and there were 7 other men all sitting down there with job applications that they had filled out. They were all just sitting down there waiting. And he went up to the desk and got his job application and sat down and began to fill it out. Now in the background there was a tapping noise going on the whole time, tapping. And after a little while, the young man put the job application down, got up and walked into the office where the boss was to be doing the interviews. And the other 7 looked at him getting up and going in there, and they wondered what nerve and effrontery on his part to get up and just go in there. And they thought certainly he was going to be disqualified now for being so brash. But a little while later, out comes the young man with the boss, and the boss has his arm around him, and says, this young man has just gotten the job, the rest of you can go home. And naturally they were all shocked. How is it that this young man got the job when they didn't? And the boss explained to them that that tapping noise they heard the whole time they were sitting there, that was Morse code, tapping out the message that said, if you hear this and understand it, come in, the job is yours. You see, of the 8 of them, he was the only one who actually stood Morse code. They were all hearing the same thing, but only one of them understood it. God speaks to us today. He speaks through His Word. He speaks through other people. He speaks through the events of our lives. He speaks to us through that still small voice. We just have to be still long enough to hear it. Some people make no attempt to hear it. I heard a man who said he had traveled around the country and visited in a number of churches, and he said over and over again he kept hearing the same message from the pulpit. Preachers would say, don't try to impress God with your works, or don't attempt to please God with your merits, or don't try to keep the rules and regulations and thus win your way into God's favor. And he said he looked around in every congregation at a nearly slumbering collection of utterly casual Christians, and he wondered to himself, who's trying? Who's even making that effort? You will seek me and you will find me when you search for me with all your heart. And as unpleasant and unhappy as the wilderness times of our lives can be, they have that ability to laser focus us in on God in ways that we never do when times are good. And then finally, in verses 11 through 20, it's in the wilderness that we learn to remember God. That almost sounds like an odd thing to say, isn't it? As good as God has been to us, to give us life, to give us salvation, all that God has given to us, isn't it odd that we need to be reminded to remember God? But we do. In all the hustle and bustle of daily life, it is so easy to forget God. I find the older I get, I just had a birthday, just turned 58, I find my memory on an almost daily basis is declining. I just don't remember things nearly as well as I used to. I love that joke about a man who was visiting relatives on the farm, and the farmer had a dog that was very impressive. The farmer whistled, and that dog came running up and herded the cattle into their pen, and then the dog even reached up and with its paw moved the latch over on the corral, moved the gate down, and to lock the cattle in. And the guy was really impressed, and he says to his uncle, he says, man, that's a great dog. What's that dog's name? The farmer thought for a minute, and he said, what's the name of that flower? It smells great, and it's got thorns on the stems. The nephew says, a rose? And he said, yeah. And he turns to his wife and says, hey, Rose, what's that dog's name? I feel like I'm getting like that. It's okay, I guess, for the natural attrition of life to take place in a physical sense, but it should never be that way spiritually. If anything, the older we get, the more we should remember God, because we understand things better than we did when we were young. If anything, we should be just growing closer and closer to God. You see, one of the ironies of life in a spiritual sense is that the more God blesses us with things, the more prone we are to forget Him. The better things are in your life, the more money you've got, the better your house is, the more comfortable your living arrangements, the more food you have to eat, the more health you have in your family, and the less problems, and all of that, all of those blessings of God, the more God gives us, the less likely we are to remember Him. That was the danger for Israel. They just left the wilderness. 40 years of deprivation and misery. They are about to enter into the promised land. And that's why Moses says to them in verse 17, look, there's a great danger on the horizon. And it is the danger of self-sufficiency in a spiritual sense. The danger of having everything in life that you ever wanted and then forgetting that it was God who gave it to you. Forgetting God, leaving Him out of your life. The wilderness makes us call on God in ways that we don't when times are good. It helps us to remember God. Now, you may wonder why God would let you go through these times in your life. Take out a map of the Bible lands one day when you're thinking that way and take a look where Egypt is and where the Promised Land is. There's only one way to get from point A to point B, and that's through the wilderness. Oswald Chambers said this, God gives us a vision, and then He takes us down to the valley to batter us into the shape of that vision. It is in the valley that so many of us give up. But every God-given vision will become real if only we will have patience. There's only one way from God to get you where you started to where He wants to get you, and that's through the wilderness. Don't give up when you go through those periods. Don't lose faith when you go through those times. Don't turn against God when you go through those times, because God has a purpose in the wilderness. It's in the wilderness that we learn to trust God. It's in the wilderness that we learn to listen to God. And it's in the wilderness that we learn to remember God. This morning we're going to sing as our song of invitation, hymn number 317, Only Trust Him. Let's stand together now.